Hello, my friends. Why am I so upbeat? Well, I just wrapped a hangout with 60 of you, listeners and subscribers, a special emergency Monday night crisis. Everything is going to be bad hangout, and it was worth it. I feel a lot better after just connecting and being with so many of you. If you were there, thank you very much. If you weren't and you're a paid subscriber, you can watch or listen to it. There's a link in today's email to paid subscribers. If not, patreon.com/Pete Dominic. You don't want to miss those type of online Zoom hangouts. They are really replenishing. According to a lot of people, very grateful that we did it on a Monday night. Thank you very much for coming. Now, joining me on today's show, I've got Eric Segall. He's going to be here at about 23 minutes, and we talk about the Supreme Court and the disaster that was decided yesterday. And then Kris Brown of Brady United is going to join me, talk about the latest on fighting gun violence, the Supreme Court cases on that, and more. That's at 47 minutes. Obviously, the big news is about the Supreme Court. I'm going to talk about that plenty with Eric, and I'm sure you've seen a ton of reaction, so I'm just going to get to the other headlines right now, because there are other things happening. And here's some good news. Steve Bannon went to prison. That's right. Sloppy Steve, taken into custody Monday after surrendering at a federal prison to begin a 4-month sentence on contempt charges for defying a subpoena in the congressional investigation into the U.S. Capitol attack. He arrived at the Federal Correctional Institute in Danbury, Connecticut around noon, was formally taken into custody. There was a whole bunch of protesters there. I'll play just a little bit of it because he and Marjorie Taylor Greene were there and they were trying to talk, but the protesters and activists were yelling and playing cowbells. You couldn't hear him, and it was great. I hate that guy. I don't like the word hate, but I hate him. He's a dirtbag. I shared a studio with him at SiriusXM, as probably most of you already know, and I was real happy to see him go to jail, and that means he can't podcast, so how about that? Republican Congresswoman has been charged with a firearm violation. It's Victoria Spartz of Indiana who's been given a court summons after authorities at Dulles International Airport say they found a handgun during a security screening. Apparently, it wasn't loaded, but she had a .380 caliber firearm during a passenger security clearance. No big deal, just a congresswoman with an unloaded gun. But apparently it's just a court summons, so I guess she'll be okay. In Ukraine, the country's domestic intelligence agency said that it had foiled another Russian plot to overthrow the government. In Gaza, Israel released the director of the territory's largest hospital after more than 7 months of detention. In New York, Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in the hush money case, is expected to make a sentencing recommendation yesterday, but it will remain confidential until his sentencing on July 11th. So that's a date you can look forward to. Hurricane Beryl made landfall on Curaçao Island, the Caribbean Sea, seen as an extremely dangerous Category 4 storm. Bad sign for the hurricane season. And the big international story I mentioned is France is starting to feel like a different place the way the U.S. is, apparently, after that country's first round of elections. And the right-wing National Rally Party won a record number of votes. President Emmanuel Macron's centrist party appeared to be near collapse. More than 500 of France's 577 legislative seats are still to be decided as of this report. The leaders of the left-wing coalition vowed that their third-place candidates would withdraw to prevent a National Rally candidate from winning the seats in Sunday's runoff election. But the message from the presidential camp was muddled. The National Rally can command an absolute majority. Macron will be forced to appoint a political adversary as prime minister. If not, the National Assembly could be ungovernable. So really important story and scary story, along with our scary story to watch and pay attention to, or not. I know many of you are wanting to look away, and I understand, and I don't blame you. But I'm going to be here every day with your news and headlines. This is what I do, and I'm happy to do all kinds of different things and hear your ideas on how to do them. So let me know. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Now let's get to the audio clips I've got for you, analysis of the Supreme Court's decision before my conversations with Eric Segall and BradyUnited.org's Kris Brown. All right, well, the first thing I want to share with you is a few clips from Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, Brett Kavanaugh, and Samuel Alito at their confirmation hearings, the latter two, and Mitch McConnell after the January 6th insurrection, basically saying that no one's above the law, that the president is not above the law, and they say it over and over. These are montages. Well, McConnell is a statement, and then the Kavanaugh and Alito are edited montages of them repeating it in different ways during their confirmation hearings. First, Here's Senator Mitch McConnell back in 2021.
President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he was in office. Didn't get away with anything yet. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
Well, it would seem that Trump is probably going to get away with it. As a matter of fact, Elie Mystal tweeted, look, I appreciate that people still want to find some way to think that Trump is going to be brought to justice for January 6th, but he will not be brought to justice. That part of the conversation is over. Trump won. People need to deal with that in their own way, but he won. And Elie went on to say that maybe because I'm black, maybe it's because I'm a Mets fan, but like sometimes we lose. Often even. More often than not, the bad guys win. They won today. Now, what are you prepared to do? I like that. Final ask. And here is that creep Brett Kavanaugh at his confirmation hearing saying nobody's above the law, except for apparently they are, according to him.
No one's above the law in the United States. That's a foundational principle that I've talked about, coming from Federalist 69, coming from the structure of the Constitution. We're all equal before the law in the United States of America. The foundation of our Constitution was that, as Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, the presidency would not be a monarchy, and it specified all the ways that under the Constitution the president is not above the law. No one is above the law in the United States of America. The Constitution is not above the law. No one's above the law in the United States. Secondly, the president serves a term in office, not an unlimited term in office, again specified in Federalist 69. The president is subject to the laws. No one's above the law in the United States, including the president of the United States. And that's something that is made clear in Federalist 69. Even in the national security context, where the Constitution gives the commander-in-chief power to the president remains subject to the law. A president is not above the law with respect to the criminal process. No one is above the law in our constitutional system. Federalist 69, Hamilton makes clear all the ways that the executive branch, as designed by the framers of the Constitution, was different from the monarchy.
Well, how about that, huh? Let's get some more. Here's Samuel Alito at his confirmation hearing back in 2006.
I don't think the president is above the law. No person in this country, no matter how high or powerful, is above the law. It has been a particular honor for me to serve on the Court of Appeals for these past 15 years because it has given me the opportunity to use whatever talent I have to serve my country by upholding the rule of law. And there is nothing that is more important for our republic than the rule of law. No person in this country, no matter how high or powerful, is above the law, and no person in this country is beneath the law. 15 years ago, when I was sworn in as a judge of the Court of Appeals, I took an oath. I put my hand on the Bible and I swore that I would administer justice without respect to persons, that I would do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that I would carry out my duties under the Constitution and the laws of the United States.
Well, there you go. McConnell, Kavanaugh, Alito saying one thing then and something quite different now. Obviously, they're all in the tank for Trump. Here's John Dean, of course, of the Nixon administration, the attorney who served as White House counsel for U.S. President Richard Nixon. He was on CNN yesterday, and Breonna Keeler asked him if Nixon would have gotten away with it under this Supreme Court.
John, just one quick question before I let you both go. What would have happened with President Nixon if this ruling were in place?
Well, there are actually two rulings in this decision. There's a 6-3 for presumptive immunity, but there's also a 5-4 on you can't even have the evidence of official conduct come to play. This to me appears to certainly influence the existing law on presidential conduct, what's available, evidentiary speaking. Amy Coney Barrett said she didn't think that it should be so restricted as the decision of the court itself was. So I think that Nixon would have survived. I think he would have walked under this ruling. And I'm sifting through all of the known evidence at the time. There's more known today, but just looking at what was in the bills of impeachment, he's not responsible. He has no criminal liability, and that was considered to be one of the elements of a high crime and misdemeanor if a president had committed a crime. Well, there are no more crimes for presidents in official conduct.
There you go, John Dean on CNN yesterday. Now let's go to legal scholar Melissa Murray with many of her reactions. This was on MSNBC yesterday.
But it should be about a court that has consistently arrogated power to itself and now is arrogating power to someone who poses a threat to democracy. And this decision poses a threat to democracy, just as the dissent said. I want to point your attention to one aspect here where they specifically talk about the allegations involving Donald Trump's conversations with Mike Pence, where Donald Trump allegedly tried to get Mike Pence to intervene to stop the certification of the Electoral College. The opinion says that whenever the president and vice president discuss their official responsibilities, they are engaging in official conduct. That is presumptively official. And the burden then is on the government to disprove that it's outside of the scope of official conduct. That totally hamstrings the government. It's also the case here that the opinion suggests that conduct that is outside of the scope, that is not subject to prosecution, cannot be used as evidence to establish that other conduct that is within the scope of prosecution has happened. So that also hamstrings the government. So this is a decision I think it would be hard to sort of say is just about the presidency full stop. It's about the presidency of Donald Trump and about allowing him to go forward and escape accountability for the actions that took place on January 6th.
All right, always great analysis from Melissa Murray, and one of our favorites, of course, Dahlia Lithwick, who noted the sexism in all the men whose judgments went for Trump and against the United States.
Yeah, I think it's not entirely inaccurate to say that it's unfortunate how gendered that turns out to be. And don't forget, if you count Amy Coney Barrett, who peels off from the majority as to one specific piece of this case, you literally have all four women justices in many places on one side of this case and the men on the other. And so then when you get this sort of like there, little missy, you're overreacting, it feels very, very familiar to a lot of us. But I think I also want to just lash it back to Justice Alito last week in the in the EMTALA abortion case, also suggesting that the dissenters, female, were emotional and that this was an emotional issue. So it does feel a little bit like 1970s vibe here, where women get positions of power only to be told that this is about abstractions and this is about, dispassionate intellectual analysis. And whatever it is you're doing, it's not that because you're just too emotional.
All right, here is Mark Elias, a brilliant and passionate lawyer, and he's founded Democracy Docket, who I follow and support. Here's his thoughts yesterday on MSNBC.
And I think that we run the risk, even on a day like today, of overly lawyering and legalizing what the Supreme Court has done. Let's be clear. The Supreme Court, as you've heard, they knew exactly what they were doing, not just for the past, but for the future. Donald Trump is campaigning on a platform of being a dictator for a day and of seeking vengeance against his enemy. And, to do that, he needs the support of a lot of people who are going to go along with him. Well, what have those people who have gone along with him learned in the last couple of weeks? Number one, that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to narrowly construe a statute that went after January 6th insurrectionists. Number two, the Supreme Court was going to let Donald Trump remain on the ballot. Number three, that the Supreme Court was going to give him basically absolute immunity, not just for what he did last time, but what he may do in the future. And that his pardon power is absolute. So let's be clear. It's not just that the Supreme Court knew what it was doing with respect to the criminal cases that have been indicted. The Supreme Court knows what it's doing with respect to empowering his attitudes and his impulses and those of his followers as we are 4 months from the next election, 4.5 months from the next set of lawsuits, 5 months from the next insurrection at the Capitol, and then potentially 4 years of him seeking vengeance and misusing power to go after his political opponents and to prosecute his case against the American people. It is a shameful day for democracy. The court has disgraced itself. And I'll tell you, every one of us needs to be steeled for a battle to stand up for the rule of law going forward.
There you go, Mark Elias, tearing it up. Love it. And now here is Rachel Maddow making a pretty good point in 2 minutes about the way Democrats are hand-wringing versus the way which Republicans aren't, but certainly should be. I like it.
But even with all of this new uncertainty, we are in this remarkable place now, right? We are officially in the middle of this mess for the United States of America, where the Republican Party has nominated someone for president who set off a violent effort to overthrow the government the last time he lost an election, who was starting off the month of July 2024, the month in which the Republican Party's going to hold its nominating convention. He's starting off that month with the CFO of his company serving time in Rikers, with his campaign manager and senior White House advisor, Steve Bannon, reporting today to federal prison, and who himself may be sentenced to Rikers or to New York State prison, depending on what sentence he's about to get after his own conviction on nearly 3 dozen felony charges. Excellent job, Republican Party. Great choice. I love how Democrats are like, oh, how did we get into this mess? It's true that not understanding how old 81 years old looks sometimes is maybe a Democratic Party mistake. But Democrats are not the party that picked the guy whose charity was shut down as a fraud, whose fake university was shut down as a fraud, whose business was convicted on multiple felony fraud counts, whose CFO is quite literally in jail, who had one personal lawyer put in prison and the other has lost his law license, who has been charged under the Espionage Act for whatever this is that he was doing with highly classified documents, including, reportedly, nuclear secrets, who was found liable by a jury for sexual assault, who has been charged with more than a dozen felonies under a RICO indictment in the state of Georgia, and who really has been found guilty by another jury of 30-plus felonies for which he is now awaiting a possible prison sentence. That's who you guys picked. I love that the worry in this instance is that the Democrats might have made a bad choice for their nominee. Only in America.
All right, there you go. And finally, I've got President Biden, who came out last night about 7:45, right before our hangout, and made this 5 minutes of comments. I'm going to include all of it. If you want to fast forward, obviously you can. But here's the president last night.
The most powerful office in the world. It's an office that not only tests your judgment, perhaps even more importantly, it's an office that tests your character. Because you not only face moments when you need the courage to exercise the full power of the presidency, you also face moments where you need the wisdom to respect the limits of the power of the office of the presidency. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation. Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power. We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. Attack on the police. The ransacking at the Capitol. A mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America. Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. The public has a right to know the answer about what happened on January 6th before they are asked to vote again this year. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely. It's a terrible disservice to the people of this nation. So now the American people will have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office and the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it. You know, at the outset of our nation, it was the character of George Washington, our first president, that defined the presidency. He believed power was limited, not absolute. And that power always resides with the people. Always. Now, over 200 years later, with today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency that are going to define the limits of the power of the presidency, because the law will no longer do it. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent. May God bless you all, and may God help preserve our democracy. Thank you. May God protect our troops.
The president last night in the White House. There you go. All right. Well, that's all the audio I've got for you and the headlines. I have two great guests coming up, though, and tomorrow I'll probably share my audio from the Hangout and much more, including Kenneth C. Davis on authoritarianism and Independence Day and how this year is going to be a little bit different. But right now, it's Eric Segall. Time to get to Eric Segall first, and then Chris Brown of Brady United joins me coming up, and I hope you will listen to both of them. I'm really happy I got both of them on. Of course, I talked to Segall live on Twitter yesterday, right after the decision came down, which a lot of you appreciated, but we were live with hundreds of people joining us for this conversation. I'm glad that we got to have. We also talked briefly about a couple of the other decisions that were made. But you know Segall, you love Segall. Does he need an introduction at this point? Supreme Myths is the pod and the book. Originalism is Faith is the second book. He writes at Dorf on Law. As always, I'd love it if you reached out to him and let him know you appreciate when he joins me. Let's do it right now with the Legal Eagle, Eric Segall. Here we are. We're live because I wanted to get to you as soon as I could. I know you're in big demand. Everybody wants to talk to you. Thank you for talking to me. You say this is worse than you thought it would be, and you're going to make me very sad. The decision today from the Supreme Court and the final day of the term on presidential immunity. Where do we start?
So let's start with 3 boxes. The Supreme Court held that when the president exercises core constitutional functions, such as commander-in-chief power, pardon power, take care the laws are faithfully executed power, he is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution for anything he does in the exercise of those official powers, which I think means, now, Peter came out 2 hours ago. It's a very long opinion. I've read it all, and I've been listening to all the people talking about it too. But I think what that means is if the president decides as a matter of military necessity that as commander-in-chief, he has to nuke California, I think he's probably immune from prosecution.
Oh, he can now nuke California. Could we choose a different state?
I'm just saying, we don't know what the president's well, so here's the problem. The first box, absolute immunity for core textually listed official acts in the Constitution. Second box, where Congress authorizes him to do something or where he shares powers with Congress. It's not his exclusive power. And that's most of the president's powers. There he has presumptive immunity. And that's the second box. And the third box is something that we all knew. He has no immunity for unofficial acts. Now, if the court had stopped there, that first box would still be problematic, absolute immunity for all core functions. But I think we could figure out a way to deal with that as a country. But the court didn't stop there, Pete. It said two other things that seemed to be tailored for Trump's case to make it harder to prosecute Trump. They said, first of all, evidence of motive and deceit. So we have to decide what's official, right? What's core, what's absolutely immune, what's presumptive, which is shared powers, and what's unofficial conduct. Motive cannot be used to separate those boxes. That's insane, Pete. No evidence of motive allowed. So if the president really thought that he had to execute an American citizen living in America as a matter of military necessity, as part of his commander-in-chief powers, the next question we would ask is, why are you doing this? What's your motive?
Sure.
Can't ask that question.
Says who? In the court's decision today.
Yes, that's what they said. So wait, let me finish this, get all on the table. So the first thing is no evidence of motive. Second, and this is the one that's really crazy, any evidence that's taken from official acts cannot come in. So in this case, for example, the court held today that President Trump is immune for his conversations with the Attorney General of the United States about what to do about Pence and all that stuff. So why? Because in discussing issues with his Attorney General, he's engaged in official core conduct. The president gets to have an Attorney General, answerable only to him. Okay, but what if he and the Attorney General talk about murdering somebody on Fifth Avenue to set a precedent to scare the American people into complying with federal law? We can't ask why he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, as long as he's talking to the Attorney General about it. It is so these two other things, no evidence of motive and no evidence of official acts to cast light on unofficial acts. So what the court has to do now, Pete, in the Jack Smith case is go through all the indictment, every single count of the indictment, and ask, is this official? Is this unofficial? And in making that decision, they can't use evidence of what are concededly official acts. And that's insane. That's just, it doesn't make any sense. I think the judges are going to be confused. Barrett didn't agree with that last couple of things, by the way, but doesn't matter because it's 5-4 on these. So there is a majority on these questions.
Wow. So the president can then, when the question was asked, can the president send Navy SEAL Team 6 to kill his political opponent? The answer is yes.
I think the answer is if he discusses with his any general, if he discusses with any official person who is under his control, whether or not this is something in the best interest of the United States under my commander-in-chief power, then he is absolutely immune under this decision. Now, Pete, let's back off a little bit. Everybody knows that what the Supreme Court says today means nothing about tomorrow. Everyone knows this. If you didn't know it before the Roberts Court, you certainly know it now. In 4 years, they've overturned abortion, affirmative action, guns, all kinds of things, separation of powers, all kinds of things. So do I really believe in my heart of hearts that if Trump and Steve Miller, who is now, chief of staff, if Trump and Steve Miller decide to assassinate a young upcoming Democratic, candidate who they're afraid of because they think that Democratic candidate is actually plotting for a coup against the United States, so they have to kill him. Do I think the Supreme Court would uphold that? No, I don't. No reasonable person should. They'll find a way to back off of this, but that isn't the point.
What about Steve Bannon if we're doing Steve? You're talking about Stephen Miller, not Steve Miller, the artist, by the way.
I think that this case is going to cause enormous confusion. And when it comes to the Trump prosecution, I'm not willing to talk about other hypotheticals so much. But when this case is, by the way, has no effect, I think, on the Florida case, because everything that happened in Florida happened after he was president. And anything that happens after he's president can't. Although you can, I don't understand how we're going to, the court left open the issue of whether his pressure on Pence to not do the legal thing, that's an open question for the lower courts. They can talk about that.
Right.
But how are we going to analyze whether that was an official or unofficial act without talking about Trump's motivation? And we're not allowed to talk about Trump's motivation.
What do you make of Mark Joseph Stern, who tweets the Supreme Court's conservatives have elevated the presidency significantly, the other two branches of federal government, awarding the president a king-like power to engage in violent, corrupt, or treasonous behavior without even the fear of prosecution for his crimes. Do you agree with that?
Pretty much. I will say this. In a moment of irony that is unparalleled in American history, I think, the same term the court makes the president a king, the court cuts off the king's men. I mean, the president now has an immunity and has power that no one ever thought he should have, while his entire administrative bureaucracy is being stopped. And Pete, that's not complicated. The Roberts Court hates regulation, but it loves.
Meaning, what I'm hearing you say is the executive branch, the president just got a lot more power, but he can't really wield it because the Supreme Court also decided on the Chevron case that all these agencies.
Not just Chevron, dozens of cases.
Dozens of cases on the administrative state.
Including one today. No, what they've done is they made it easy. This is what they've done. This would be the tweet if I was smart enough. What they've done is they made it much easier. Pete, I got to tweet this. Don't tweet this out for me.
Okay.
Or you can tweet under my name. They made it much easier for the president to be a criminal and much harder for the president to be a president. That's what they've done.
Well, I can't write that and talk to you at the same time. Okay.
But that is what they've done. They made it easier for him to be a criminal and harder for him to do the legal things he's supposed to do. It's an amazing thing. Dahlia, we tweeted somebody saying an imperial presidency for an imperial court. I agree with that. I think that's accurate.
An imperial court creates imperial presidency.
Yeah, I think that's all accurate. I really feel bad for the judge in the Jack Smith case in D.C. because this is going to be so hard to untangle, Pete. And of course, and they knew this, the delay now is going to be forever because there are no right and wrong answers to the puzzles the court remanded to the district court. There's just no right or wrong answers. It's and I don't even know what it means to say you can't introduce evidence of motive. What does that even mean? If the president in his heart of hearts believed the election was stolen, and in his heart of hearts believed Pence had the power to do something about it, then he's immune. How do we know if he believed that in his heart of hearts? We go to motive. No, we're not allowed to ask that question. So I don't even know what that means, Pete. And the lower court judges won't either. It's a mess. It's a hot mess. By the way, I want to make a couple other points real quick. So Sotomayor writes really as angry a dissent for the liberals as can be imagined. That surprised all of us. We thought the court was going to come out on this, with most unanimity on most of the questions. I told you last week I thought this was going to be a very strong opinion that, they've already gotten the delay. No, this is a disaster. It's an unmitigated disaster. It's why they held it for the last case of the term. And if you read the liberals' dissent, it is really, really mad. And Sotomayor even says our democracy is now in grave danger, or danger. I forget if she used the word grave. They don't do that often. They pick their spots. They're not Scalia. They're not Scalia. They pick their spots.
Steve Vladeck writes, historically, SCOTUS has bent over backwards to avoid splitting right down ideological or partisan lines in cases of such national importance. Its failure to avoid these optics here is a major institutional failure, whether you're more or less sympathetic to the bottom line. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. So here's the thing, Pete. People like Steve Vladeck, who I truly admire and is a friend. People like Marty Lederman, who's a law professor at Georgetown, who I truly admire, and we're friends, I think, and a bunch of other progressive law professors are coming out today with statements like that. Marty tweeted earlier today, any pretense that text, history, or tradition matters to this court after this case should go away, because none of this is based on text, history, or tradition. It's all based on policy. And my answer to them is, hey, guys, you know what? You're about 15 years too late.
Yeah.
Where were you, in 2012? More importantly, where were you in 2016 when I was being literally castigated by all of these people for saying we should have a 4-4 evenly divided court for the rest of the time? And they all said to me, no, Hillary's going to be president and we're going to have a liberal court and it's going to be great. And I said, if that happens and we have a liberal court, then politics will go to the right by 3 standard deviations. And if Trump gets elected, you're going to regret this. Let's just go for a 4-4 evenly divided fucking court so they can't do shit like this. And all the liberal, Pete, with the exception of Kris, I'm sorry, I'm getting out my emotions now. I'm sorry. With the exception of Kris Sprigman at NYU, Mark Tushnet at Harvard, and a couple other people, the entire academy laughed at me. The entire progressive.
All right, now back to what this means for us.
Sorry, Pete.
That's okay.
If
everybody would listen to you, I mean, if everybody would have voted for Hillary Clinton with all their misgivings, we wouldn't be in the situation either. There's a lot.
Well, no, but we'd have a very liberal Supreme Court that 10 years from now would lead to a conservative backlash. So it wouldn't matter.
Well, it certainly would matter.
Well, it would matter, but only for a short period of time. What this means for us is President Trump is very unlikely to be prosecuted successfully in the D.C. case. The Georgia case and the Florida case are a little different. Although, let's take the Georgia phone call for a minute.
Yeah.
So he calls the Secretary of State and says, I need exactly one more vote than necessary to win your state, whatever. Does that give him immunity in terms of trying to foster a fake election, false election? I don't know. It depends what his motive was. If he really thought the election was stolen, he's immune. If he didn't, he's not immune, but we can't ask that question. So how does that case go forward? I have no idea. And no one does anybody else. So, I mean, it's just what they did is in the Nixon case, Pete, and Bush versus Gore, in both U.S. versus Nixon involving Watergate and Bush versus Gore involving Bush and Gore, there was closure by the time the last word was written. We knew what the opinion meant. There is no closure here.
You tweeted earlier, Nixon would have likely been immune under the standard the court made up today.
A lot of people are saying that. Yeah. I don't know for sure, but yes, it feels like he could not have been prosecuted, and everybody assumed he could have been prosecuted back then.
You also said that today's decision is unconscionably bad and definitely intended to help Trump, which is why they claim they aren't doing that. Say more.
Well, they said somewhere in the opinion at the very end that, we have to do an opinion for the ages. We're not looking at, we have to write an opinion broader than our current issue. No, they wrote an opinion to help Trump. That's what they did. And they did not write an opinion for the ages. When you write an opinion for the ages, that suggests clarity. There is not clarity. Let me give you another example, Pete. My con law nerds and I have been arguing about this morning. Self-pardons, okay? The court says the president has absolute immunity when he uses the pardon power. Absolute immunity. Now, let's say he pardons himself. What does that mean? Well, if he has the power to pardon himself, then it feels like he can't have it, then he has immunity. If he doesn't, then he doesn't have immunity, but we can't ask about motive or evidence, so I don't know. No one knows. No one knows. It's really bad. Let me say one real quick thing about one other case, Pete. So the court also held today that when you sue an administrative agency for injuries, the statute of limitations, which should run from the date of the regulation, which makes sense, Pete, obviously, agency passes a regulation. You have 6 years to sue. If you don't sue in 6 years, the statute of limitation bars your suit. It makes a lot of sense because we don't want, if an agency regulation has been there for 6 years and doing all this stuff, the reliance interest on that will be substantial. Court today rules over this 6-3, that the statute of limitations begins when the injury occurs, not when the regulation was passed. So what that means is DOJ issues some regulation about transgender bathrooms, and you don't challenge it, and then your kid goes to school 15 years later. You can challenge it 15 years later. It doesn't make any sense. It creates more uncertainty with administrative regulations, and what it basically does is it makes it so between the reversal of Chevron and this case today, judges have more ability and more power to reverse agency rules, and plaintiffs have much more power to file suit to challenge those rules because they no longer have to do it within 6 years of the date of the rule's emergence.
And
that's terrible.
And one more case on social media usage, whether or not states can control users' access, et cetera.
The court basically said the lower courts did it all wrong, go back and do it over. But the court strongly suggested that there's serious First Amendment issues with both the Florida and Texas's laws that tried to get Facebook and Twitter to not take content off of their website. Eventually, I think those cases will end up going the way they should, which is the First Amendment prohibits Florida and Texas from telling Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, TikTok, that you can't take down certain material. But there's still more work to be done there. But the court basically said the courts did it wrong. And you know what, Pete? I think that's probably the right decision.
Okay, so this was the last day of the term. This is the last case that they decided. That's it. The disaster of June is July 1st. It's over. Was it worse than you thought it would be? The bloodbath of decisions, whether it be on the administrative state, abortion access, guns, and obviously immunity, and there were so many others. How do you want to recap it all? I mean, I'm sure we'll talk again, but
yeah, it's a great question, Pete. So I'm going to give a tentative answer today, okay? And I ask your audience to bear with me. This answer could be massaged over the next week because it's been 2 hours since the term ended. My tentative answer is it's much worse than I expected because the court was super clever politically. The court isn't always clever politically, but it was super clever politically. It ducked both abortion cases. Ducked them. That helps Trump win. It did Section 3 of the 14th Amendment disqualification really quickly. That helped Trump. It delayed immunity and then issued this horrific ruling. That helped Trump. And while all of that is going on, it takes apart the administrative state in very serious ways. The one thing the court did that I think is prominent, important, and good is they walked back the Second Amendment insanity a little bit. The court did clearly recognize it made a mistake with the Bruin case, and it clearly walked. No, that's important. We shouldn't, trying to be fair.
Yeah, in terms of domestic violence, people who have committed crimes having access to a gun, that was that case. But they also allowed the bump stocks to be continued to be used.
Correct. That's fair. But the bump stock case, again, technically, it's a terrible decision, Pete. I think it was really wrong. We talked about it. But Congress can technically change that decision. That's a fault of Congress. Congress can put that back in tomorrow if it had the votes to do it.
Plus, anybody can make a bump stock if they wanted to.
And Pete, we have to be. So one thing that I'll leave your audience with this thought, because I'm such a harsh critic of the court. When people talk about the court ending women's ability to have reproductive rights, and that's been a big thing since Dobbs, my answer always is, not yet. The court hasn't done that yet. South Carolina is doing that. Georgia's doing that. Texas is doing that. Idaho is doing that. All the court said is you make your own decisions. That's not the same thing as the court saying, for example, the fetuses have constitutional rights and states can't prohibit abortions. So same thing with the bump stocks. It's a bad decision. It's wrong, but it's not a constitutional decision. Congress can fix it. It's when the court gets into the constitutional business, like in the Bruin case, where it stops 50 states from regulating the way they want to, where nobody can do anything about it except a constitutional amendment, which never happens. It can't really happen. That's when it's really bad. And so that's what I want to say about the bump stock case.
And the Chevron case for different reasons in terms of its overall.
Well, I think so. Only Justice Thomas suggested that Chevron is a constitutional decision. In other words, I think Congress can pass a law tomorrow saying when you challenge agency action, the agency gets a strong presumption of validity when it interprets the laws. Thomas says Congress can't do that, but Thomas isn't.
I'm not asking the constitutional question. I'm asking the impact question. And the impact of that decision is far-reaching as opposed to...
The impact of the entire term is far-reaching. And the amazing thing is they did it in the least hostile way to the Republican Party possible, which is really that balance between doing dastardly things but not doing dastardly things that help the Republican Party, that hurt the Republican Party, is a balance this court is expert at.
I think that's the best point, and I'll let you go. But my question about that is, because the outcomes are so good for Republicans, and that, for example, doesn't remind women what they've lost because they punted it before the election. Because of that, can you explain to people watching or listening, do they collude? Do they talk? Does Alito and Thomas talk about this decision so that it can have a positive outcome? Does the Chief Justice talk with Amy Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch, and they all get together so that they can make sure that they have the outcome that you're saying helps Republicans in election time?
So my bottom line answer is I don't know, and nobody knows except the law clerks who work for them. My fairly educated guess, which is a fairly educated guess, is 95% of the time they communicate by memo. Somebody will issue a majority opinion, and they're trying to hold together 5 votes. And then somebody writes back and says, I don't like paragraph 3 on page 4. Would you please change it? But in the biggest cases, in the Bush versus Gores, Dobbs, affirmative act. In those cases, my guess is they don't talk explicitly about the political consequences because it's not in their DNA to do that. But is it in the back of every conversation? 100%.
Harlan Crow and the Koch bros, the remaining one, they sure won this term.
Everybody who wants a safe country lost, and everybody who wants business to maximize profits at the expense of safety won. And that is the, other than the Trump immunity case, that's the biggest takeaway from this term.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you to everybody watching here live on Twitter. I'll post this on Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where you're going to be doing a whole bunch of more interviews. Is there anything else you want to plug before I knock us off Twitter?
Nah, I'm doing a bunch of stuff, but I am doing a thing for, you may see me on local news because I'm doing a thing for Scripps, which does me in the studio, then sends it out to all the news stations.
Okay, so that's cool.
I'm doing that tonight.
Well,
but I got a bunch of podcasts. But hey, listen, audience, Pete's audience, specifically Twitter audience, this immunity case could have been written in a very coherent, persuasive, and reasonable way for the American people, because even the most, everyone agrees the president gets some immunity. We just do. Like, you can't have a president being sued left and right every day. We agree on that. But the way they did it with the no evidence of motive and the no evidence of official acts is clearly meant to help Trump. And we didn't know, this is my biggest takeaway, I guess, of this podcast, or this Twitter session, or both. What we didn't know until today is how much in the tank they are for Trump personally. That's what we didn't know. Now we know.
Thank you very much for talking to me, for giving us your expertise and insights. You looked great. You sounded great. And we're always happy when you join us, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. All right, there he goes, Eric Segall. We were live on Twitter yesterday. You can watch it. You can see it on our Twitter account. It's still up there if you want to watch it and share it. That'd be great. Let them know that you heard him here on the show. And now it's time to get to Kris Brown, who I absolutely love. This woman is such a born leader. She's so smart, and I'm always happy when I get to talk to her. I actually caught up with her last week and had some issues trying to get this interview up. But she's the president of BradyUnited.org, and she is a really, really smart woman who worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. She is a veteran, of course, of gun violence prevention work and a smart lawyer herself. I've talked to her several times. I'm always happy when I do. We cover the latest Supreme Court decision and more. BradyUnited.org to support them. And let Kris know you heard her here on the show at KrisB_Brown on Twitter, at BradyBuzz on Twitter to follow them as well. Let's do it right now. Yes, there she is. Oh, we're very honored to have you back on the show, Kris. All the good work that you're doing. So much to talk about with you. How are things over at Brady? You're very busy, I'm guessing.
We are very busy, Pete. We have a lot of different areas of focus right now, from policy to our work in our connected PAC, because we have a big election coming up. Lots of enforcement work that we're doing now that we finally have a director of ATF, and our culture change work in addition to legal. So every day we're moving forward as much as we can to save lives.
Yeah, let's talk about the ATF and its importance. I kind of feel like the ATF is maybe the first or second most biggest boogeyman to a lot of kind of states' rights, quote, conservative right-wing folks, and has been for a long time. I have obviously the IRS takes your money and the ATF takes your guns, however you want to put it. But give us a little bit of a history on your relationship with the ATF, or more specifically, if you want, what they're supposed to be doing and why it's been such a struggle to be able to, for them to do their job. One thing I know is they've got a huge shortage, I think, of actual agents.
They have a huge shortage of agents. They have been, as you note, Pete, kind of the favorite whipping boy of various members of Congress who have sought to reduce their funding over the years. In their entire history, going back over 40 years, they've had 2 permanent directors ever, which, as you know, a federal agency with this kind of remit really needs a leader at the top to be able to provide the guidance and direction for the agency. It's not without nominations that have occurred by presidents, because it's confirmed by Congress, but the National Rifle Association historically and the National Shooting Sports Foundation, 2 organizations that are really actively working to make us far less safe in this country. have quashed a lot of the nominations that have gone forward until this Congress. And Joe Biden put forward Steve Dettelbach, who was confirmed as the director, and he's just doing an incredible job leading these agents who have a really, really tough remit. Basically, what it comes down to for their job, Pete, is the ATF is the agency that regulates and licenses gun dealers in this country. And we have more gun dealers than McDonald's and Starbucks combined, about 80,000 of them. And so we need to provide funding and support for this agency because most gun dealers don't have a single crime gun associated with their sales in any given year. Zero. They're doing the right thing. They're spending the money for oversight, for training, but about 5% of them are responsible for 90% of the crime guns that we find recovered in crime, murders, homicides in this country. So it's in the public's interest to have a strong ATF, better enforcement of gun dealers and their practices across this country.
How in the past have outside organizations quashed nominations? How do they have so much power? They influence, I guess, the senator to not nominate or stand in the way of a nomination?
Correct. And what they'll do is go and, frankly, lie about the intent or the focus of the nominee, spread misinformation about the history and background of the nominee in an attempt to quash them. And so what happens is you will have an acting director who has no real authority to lead the organization. That's what we had over the entire Trump presidency, over the entire Obama presidency. We did not have a confirmed director of this critical agency leading it. And that's why Steve Dettelbach, who's a former prosecutor, someone who really understands these laws and is a friend to law enforcement and a friend to gun dealers who are following all of the rules, which is the majority of them, is so important because ultimately this agency, the key thing that they can do is reform or shut down the dealers who are making us all way less safe and profiting off of it.
You know, put your feelings aside, however you feel about law enforcement, police officers in the country. I feel like that there usually there should be a consensus across the 17,000 law enforcement agencies and the federal government and state government law enforcement about guns in general. I know there's not, and individually I know there's not, but you would think that you would, if you were a cop, the family of a cop, you would want to keep guns out of criminals' hands however you can. What is the thinking and the consensus? Is it fragmented? Is it all over the place when it comes to actual law enforcement agencies, or more importantly, I guess, policymakers within those law enforcement agencies?
I think historically there has been a lot of support by law enforcement rank and file officers, right, about the need to better enforce the laws that are on the books related to background checks, for example. You don't find a lot of disagreement about that issue at all. I think that some organizations, the Fraternal Order of Police comes to mind, which received a lot of money from the National Rifle Association over the years, has resisted taking any positions in support of things like background checks, even though their rank and file members strongly support these kinds of policy objectives. So I think politics and money, which is often the case, Pete, with these things, get in the way of lifting up the voices of law enforcement officers across the country because they, after all, just like too many of us, our friends and neighbors, feel like we're on the front line of this public health epidemic. There's no question police officers are. And they also risk their lives and are faced with crime guns sold, illegally.
It makes it more insidious to then take money from those agencies and then put your own rank and file members in danger is how I'm interpreting that.
That's the fact.
Do you know where you were when you learned of what a bump stock was? I mean, you are the president of Brady. You know a lot of stuff, but I mean, I think most of us found out about it in 2017 when the nation's deadliest modern mass shooting took place at this music festival in Las Vegas. Everybody remembers it. But the guy, I think he fired like more than 1,000 bullets. He killed 60 people, wounded hundreds of others. And after this horrible massacre, the public, former president, and others learned what a bump stock was and overwhelmingly seemed to think, yeah, we shouldn't have those. And then ATF issues a rule clarifying that bump stocks are categorized as machine guns under the Federal Gun Control Act and the National Firearm Act, and then starts to make its way through the courts. Help me understand a little bit of the history about what we learned about these and how they were going to be regulated, and now, thanks to the Ayatollahs on our Supreme Court, it doesn't seem to be that we can do anything.
Yeah, Pete, I'll never forget being up close with the ravaging impact of bump stocks, which were designed many, many, many years ago, initially marketed for individuals who had some kind of handicap, some issue with how their hands could grip a firearm. That's how they were initially marketed. But the reality of how bump stocks actually work in horrific situations, as you noted in Vegas, is the stock of the firearm is basically fitted with this bump stock. And when you pull the trigger of a semi-automatic weapon, instead of having to repeatedly pull the trigger, which is really the difference between a semi-automatic weapon and a machine gun, where you pull the trigger once and it sprays bullets everywhere. Those were banned in 1934.
And it's the difference between living and dying. It's the difference between the death and casualty count. I mean,
correct.
It's obvious.
Correct. And so when you pull the trigger of a semi-automatic weapon fitted by a bump stock, the bump stock basically ricochets against your finger, so you don't technically really have to pull again. It allows you to repeatedly fire. It has the same impact, essentially, as a machine gun. And that's why Brady and every other gun violence prevention organization across this country has said a bump stock converts a semi-automatic weapon to a machine gun. And when people learned about this and understood that the shooter in Vegas and the whatever floor he was, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, I was there the next day, and it's shocking to take this in. He was football fields away from the victims. They had no idea what was happening. He sprayed thousands of bullets and specifically bought bump stocks because he wanted to simulate the same kind of rapid fire as a machine gun. President Trump, former President Trump, is the person who signed an executive order banning these bump stocks, which is supported by over 80% of Americans. You're right. As a result of that, the ATF was directed, they just did what the executive branch told them to do, to write a regulation calling for the no further sales of bump stocks. They're illegal, regulating them under the 1934 National Firearms Act. It wound its way through the Supreme Court. The NRA and the NSSF appealed that and argued it violated the Constitution to ban these, that they could not be categorized as machine guns under the 1934 Act. In a 6-3 decision, this court agreed with those arguments. And it's very chilling to actually read the decision. It's hyper-technical. And I think Sotomayor got it right in her dissent. If something walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's a duck. This is a machine gun when this particular device is used to fit it. And I think folks appropriately commented that these justices, these 6 justices who decided this case, when bump stocks are used again for a mass shooting, and they will have blood on their hands. And I take no joy. It's horrific to think how easy it would have been for this court, like they justify so many other decisions that they're making to take people's rights away, to say, well, of course, these function just like a machine gun. They didn't exist in 1934, or else Congress probably would have banned them then. We are going to uphold this. They could have done that. They didn't. And we all have to think about that and the impact of the kinds of cases winding their way to the Supreme Court come November.
So my understanding then was, well, the court also said in their decision, if you want to ban these, correct me if I'm wrong here, then you need congressional legislation to do it. So the U.S. Senate went into action, Democrats did, to try to force just a voice vote on a bill to ban bump stocks. And Senate Republicans blocked the legislation that would have done that, to outlaw the bump stocks. Do I have it right so far?
You have it right so far. That's exactly right.
So what happened there? Like the massacre takes place. Even the disgraced former president's like, well, I don't even know. I think we should, maybe this or bad. I don't know. I mean, he said it in public. I remember watching this press conference. I think Senator Feinstein was there. I remember she'd always been, heroic on trying to get gun regulations, gun controls in effect. And I remember the exchange they had, and the public was just shocked by it. But so what happened? Like, what does public opinion, is it just about it wanes and people forget about that massacre and what these bump stocks are? And so then Republicans in this case can vote to block the legislation? Like, what are the politics of it? Why can't they get it together?
I think it's two things. One, it is time, right? And so time passing, how is it that President Trump, who after MSD, where we lost 17 children and educators, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, February 14th, 2018.
Yeah, they just tore down the building, I think.
They just tore down the building. So many parents, all of these years later, continuing to feel the pain of the loss, which they'll feel for the rest of their lives. Trump the next day came out and said, this is crazy. We should do more to address this issue. Let's make sure that we expand Brady background checks. He had a whole press conference where he talked about this. And then later that day, he had burgers with Wayne LaPierre, literally at the White House, then the head of the National Rifle Association. And he stepped back from all of that. So my armchair analysis of this is, in the wake of Vegas, the deadliest mass shooting in history, within a few days after that, all of America was decrying bump stocks that most people, frankly, had never even heard of. And it seemed like a very discreet, easy thing for the administration to do, to be able to say, hey, we hear you, we're reacting to this. Now, all of this time has passed. And while most Americans, if questioned, would still say, I see no point in being able to sell those for civilian use, that's absolutely crazy. What the Republicans, and I don't want to be partisan about this, but ultimately we are talking about one side of the chamber who voted this down. What they are doing is basically counting on the fact that people are distracted at this point by other things, and it's not going to be a political issue.
I have this theory that it's less about the money that the NRA and other organizations and individuals donate to campaigns, and more about the perception of the vote. It used to be a lot more about the money, I think, but now
you're 100% right.
So meaning a Republican in Congress votes this way, not because he wants the approval of the NRA and their money. I mean, two things can be true, but because if he doesn't, he's going to get savaged by his own constituents who say, or primaried by somebody.
It's primaried.
Yeah.
That's in if you talk to most legislators on Capitol Hill, with a few exceptions, like there, you don't find a lot of lawmakers on either side of the aisle who take joy in wearing an assault weapon pin like Marjorie Taylor Greene does, which is all about her being on the House floor, that being seen, and her raising money from an extremist group in this country. Let's be very clear about that. What the average elected official in Congress will tell you is, I agree with everything that Brady stands for. Very sensible, very basic sort of stuff. But I'm telling you, as a Republican, if I get up and talk about this, I will be primaried, and the other side is going to put money into that candidate, and I may lose my seat. That's what they say.
That is the thing, and I think people don't quite understand that. So where do we go next with the bump stock issue? What is the plan?
Well, the only time I will ever agree with Alito is to say in his concurrence, he said, well, given what we're ruling, Congress now has to act, and that's where we are. If we want a national bump stock ban, Congress needs to enact it. And we have to keep that in mind as we vote in November, because it will be a top priority, as it was for Senator Schumer. And it needs to be a top priority as people go in the ballot box and vote for their members of Congress, and in a lot of states also, who's going to represent them in the United States Senate.
You guys are doing a great job doing your best to keep these issues in the forefront, which is, of course, why I wanted to talk to you. Not always at the height of a massacre or a decision, but on a day when maybe people aren't thinking about it. What else are you guys doing in terms of whether it be local or state elections or initiatives to get people in office that will vote for, quote, common sense, anti-violence, gun regulation?
Well, we have a separate organization called Brady PAC. We've endorsed hundreds of candidates, mainly in federal races across this country. I would encourage your listeners to go to bradypac.org to find out information about those candidates. We have a priority to put survivors and true gun violence prevention champions in office. It makes a huge difference to have authentic voices helping lead this in both chambers, in the House and the Senate. And we have some incredible...
Oh, she got cut off, ladies and gentlemen. At that point, her power went out in her office, or her home office. And what she was going to say is we have some incredible candidates. Go to bradypac.org. We were just about done, but go to bradyunited.org and Brady PAC and support her. And thank you, Kris, for joining me. I hope that your power comes back on and your air conditioning works, because it is hot. All right, there you go. Kris Brown, Eric Segall, news, headlines, rundown. I'll be here for you every day, and we will do whatever we can to support each other through all of this madness. I cannot do it without your support. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. You can always pay more if you want. You can write a rating and review on Spotify and iTunes. That helps a lot. Subscribe to all my social media, and I will talk to you right here tomorrow.
You've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you gotta stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You gotta stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. Point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw the land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no one's try. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run